Morning, everyone. I am going to be doing part of my class online. Usually we have a question and answer session in person for PChem. Instead, I've asked for those questions to be submitted online, and I'm going to answer them. And so this might be of interest to anyone who has questions when you're looking at the book. And I'm going to post it online, but I might be referencing the PChem test for those of you who are going to be interested in that PChem test, because this is part of the class. And actually, your questions do have something to do with the way the whole class works and with the PChem of it all. And I'll mention that. So it's not just good for reading the book and showing to me that you've read the book. This information is going to actually be important for our exam that's coming up in a couple of weeks. With all that said, let's get to the questions. I've got 5 questions here today. The first question is in Chapter 1. We talked about arsenic life. How toxic is organic arsenic? And I always, it's always a little bit weird to me. The division between organic and inorganic is not quite as clear of a line as the words seem to indicate. Seem to say that if you're organic, you're completely organic, carbon-based. Inorganic is completely inorganic. But then there's a field called bioinorganic chemistry. In a sense, the book is all about that. So yes, the lines are blurry, and it's a good question to ask about where do the lines end. The thing about organic arsenic is it's any arsenic that's combined with carbon in any way. And if you look down at the bottom of the screen, if you look over there, you'll see that there's arsenic compound that is actually is used as a feed ingredient for chickens. I'm guessing it's probably antibiotic in some way, and for some reason it is more deadly to bacteria than to chickens. But it's controversial because it's probably still a little deadly to chickens. So basically, arsenic by itself, or arsenic in the arsenate form, which is the way that you would find it, say, in Mono Lake, is probably the most toxic. The cell can handle a little bit of it, but it tries to get rid of it in some way. One of the ways in which it tries to get rid of it, by the way, is to add it on to carbon-containing compounds, to turn it from inorganic arsenic, AsO4, into organic arsenic, which would be something like what you see down here. It's actually a very common way to detoxify itself. And so you have organic arsenic compounds, and if the organic arsenic compound can be cleaved and can produce inorganic arsenic, well, then you're back where you started. You still have the inorganic arsenic that can be pose the problems that it has. So yeah, and I'm assuming that the inorganic arsenic is the biggest problem because it looks so much like phosphate, and we talked about how that causes toxicity. So really good question. Organic arsenic is less toxic, but because it can be easily interconverted to inorganic arsenic, it's probably, it can become more toxic, and it's still toxic. And there's other, like, less toxic forms of arsenic. You see right there that there's some monosodium methyl. Just methylating the arsenic makes it less toxic. And you can use it in agriculture, but you're still using it to kill something. You're just hoping that it keeps one thing you want to live alive and kills the thing that you want to kill. Interesting question, and it's a good point about how the cell deals with a toxic threat. It combines it with stuff it's got laying around, and it forms a bond, and then you get things that look like this rocks are sewn on the other hand. So we move on to our next question, is Chapter 2. And it's talking about how DNA and RNA are more limited. They only have 5 possibilities, technically 4 each of them. And compared to the 20 amino acid letters, there's less chemical diversity. And yet there is some chemical diversity, right? And the chemical diversity in amino acids is honestly, it's not that broad relative to overall chemical diversity. Since life can get by with making proteins out of 20 amino acids, could simpler life get by with making something that's not a protein but looks like a protein from the 4 or 5 nucleotides that are possible? This is definitely a possibility, and in fact, when we get to Chapter 5, we'll talk about this exact possibility, and it leads to a big question. In Chapter 5, we'll see that there's people who think that life started this way because it's so much simpler to make something out of 4 components than out of 20. And that's reasonable. You can get something that looks like a protein. We know that there are ribozymes that are like enzymes. They always seem to not work so well. But there are whole labs that work with DNA, and they use DNA to randomly express it, and then they make binding functional molecules out of it. If a lab can make a functional molecule out of DNA, then so could life, potentially. It just looks like it's harder. The question is, how much harder is it? Is the simplicity that you gain by working with RNA to make a molecule better or worse than the complexity you lose by not having the chemical functionalities of like the sulfur groups and the other kinds of things that proteins can do? There's probably not an inherent reason. It's more like it's more tilted and there's trade-offs. With that in mind, I will still say that I'm still not convinced that RNA was the first molecule, even though we see it doing both jobs. We see it carrying information on the one hand and building functional biochemistry molecules on the other hand. So that's the RNA first hypothesis of where life comes from. And there's a lot of people, probably Dr. Grabo is on this side because he works with RNA and he's seen what it can do. On the other hand, that doesn't involve like metals as much. It doesn't involve cycles. It doesn't involve energy. I'm of the opinion that even more fundamental than having these complex molecules that do stuff is having the patterns and flows that move energy around in cycles. And that's what's fundamental to life. And for those, you don't necessarily need proteins. You don't necessarily even need RNA. What you need is you need metals or some kind of chemical complexity that you can build a cycle out of. And you need small organic compounds, and you need metals, and basically what you need is metabolism. And so what you have is you have this other school of thought that goes away from that you need RNA to do things. RNA came first. Metabolism could have come first. I'm on the metabolism first side, more on that in Chapter 5. But part of that is because I like the periodic table, and it's dependent on the periodic table, like iron can catalyze some metabolic-like reactions by itself with just the product and reactant, and you just have iron around. So why, you do go down in complexity from proteins to RNA, but you also go down in complexity if you go from RNA to metals from the periodic table. And to me, that looks more plausible even than having an RNA enzyme as simple as it could be. I think RNA enzymes probably did come first, but they were very simple and they were built off of the metabolism. But that's the whole question. What came first? It's kind of the chicken and the egg question for origin of life chemists. Very good question, and more on that to come. Our last three questions are from Chapter 3, and this is where we really get into the formation of the elements and things like that. We have this particular plot right here, and this is showing the abundance of different elements. Basically the abundance over the whole universe of all the different elements. Note that it's a log plot, and so hydrogen is way up on the log plot. It's even higher if you account for the fact that if you did it on a linear plot, it would actually look like an exponential curve, an e to the negative x function. Isn't that interesting, physical chemists? But anyways, if we look at this, the thing that most people notice when they look at this is that you have the zigzag pattern on this. In our chart, it was shown as two different lines, I believe, or different symbols, because you notice that you tend to have even-numbered elements with even numbers of protons. You have more of them, relatively speaking. And iron itself is an example of this. Iron is very abundant, and we have a question about that coming up. Why would this be? This is not a chemical reason. This is actually a physics reason. Chemical physics might be the way to talk about this, because it has to do not with the force between electrons and protons, but the force between protons. And chemists usually are working with electrons, so honestly this is a little bit out of my field, because it involves, why would you, when you pack protons together, why would even numbers of protons be able to be more stable than odd numbers of protons? So the answer is, in the equations for the force, of course you have the force holding, the physical force holding the protons together. That's a nuclear force that is binding the nucleons together. Why would there be a reason why even would be more stable? Well, actually there's a possible reason that has to do with even why electron levels are more stable sometimes. If you remember from other chemistry classes, sometimes if you have two electrons, they can have different spins. And if you have paired and opposite spins, they can fit into the same energy level, and that is a more stable arrangement. Actually, there's a bit of complexities to it, but you can work out what the numbers are with the physics equations of how spin affects energies. The observation of this even number of protons being favored is, by the way, called the Otto-Harkins rule. I didn't know until I just looked that up. What I like about this is I can look these things up and I can pull these things off for you to answer your questions better than me just flying off on it. The nuclear binding force might get extra stability from protons having spins that are opposite, being able to sort of fit in the same energy level and having some sort of stability boost from the opposite spins. Odd numbers, you can't have paired spins. We aren't sure it's put on the Wikipedia. I got this from Wikipedia for one thing, and we're not sure about it. But think about it that way. There's a possible nuclear force. Whatever it is something having to do with the nuclear force, which is honestly a physics branch, and it has to do with physics equations. So I'm going to leave that to the physicists to fully explain. Chapter 3 is kind of there's another question. Our fourth question is, when will the sun die? Because we talk about how the stars were created and gravity ignites the star, right? And then you have the energy coming out of the star and the energy going into the star, in a sense. Energy, by the way, is kind of an interesting philosophical term if you get into what is really going on. And I'm going to get into that in the next question. For this question, we'll just say that for a star to ignite, you have the opposing forces of gravity pulling it in, and then you have the energy from the fusion of the elements coming out and pushing it out, literally. You know, you have solar wind, you have particles coming out, and you also have radiant energy coming out. You have photons coming out, whichever way you want to talk about it. You have stuff coming out that pushes the star out, and you have the gravity pulling the star in. A star is a dynamic balance between these two forces, the inner force of gravity and the there's some word for it, but like centrifugal, centripetal. It's not quite like that. The going in force and the coming out force of the matter coming out. Now, as the atoms fuse, eventually you'll get to a point where you have the most stable nucleus possible. If you don't have, once you get to the most stable nucleus, there's not a spontaneous reaction anymore for going for the nuclear fusion. Nuclear fusion is not spontaneous once you've sort of spent all the energy and you brought all the nuclei down to the lowest level. This most stable nucleus, by the way, is iron. You can actually calculate from how stable the nuclei are. For some reason, iron has the most stable nucleus. And so if you have a collection of nuclei, and if they're allowed to actually combine and fuse, if you have things bigger than iron, that they will undergo fission, and they will be more stable when they end up at iron. And if you have things that are smaller than iron, they will undergo fusion and will eventually become iron. So you can actually calculate how stable iron is, how much of the different elements you have around. You can get those abundances from starlight and the other kind of calculations that came from the last question. And you can basically say, okay, how much energy do I have with the gravity pulling things in, giving me certain energy, compacting, and then we have the matter and energy leaving the star. And eventually that process, the gravity, as matter leaves the star, and as gravity pulls things in, eventually you'll end up with a case where your spontaneous reactions are all used up. It's kind of interesting. Energy is really an interesting concept, but it does tell us whether things happen. And it tells us that eventually, once it gets to iron, it's not going to happen anymore. There's nothing to happen because iron is the most stable. It's like the ball has rolled down the hill into the valley, and the ball is sitting at the bottom of the valley. It's just going to sit there. And so that's what our physics equations tell us about the stability of iron, and that's what we have. And again, this is actually related to the last question. These last three questions are nicely related, so I put them in order. And you can see these calculations are that something like the sun will last billions of years. The sun is about 5 billion years old right now, and right now we are at this point on its life cycle. And the different stages, by the way, the different stages all come from physical chemistry calculations. what happens as more and more of the sun's fuel gets spent and more of the sun goes to iron. You end up with an expansion phase where you put out more red light. Therefore, you have a red giant. Eventually, the balance between these two forces changes. The sun expands, but then it overexpands and it collapses and becomes like a white dwarf, and a lot of energy goes out. Sometimes you can have a supernova if you have if the collapse is so fast that it releases a lot of matter and energy. So again, we're talking about stellar astrophysics here. This is kind of a little bit beyond chemical physics and physical chemistry, but I want you to see the idea of the opposing forces. And if you can calculate those opposing forces for any reaction, which is what we talk about in physical chemistry, you can actually get calculations like this. You just need to know a little more about astrophysics. But believe it or not, you're surprisingly close to being able to do this kind of calculation yourself. We'll do variants of this kind of opposing forces calculation. In a sense, an equilibrium calculation, chapter 4 in Atkins, is going to be two opposing reactions and what happens. And so finally, this is a sort of a related question. Where does the energy come from? It talks about after the elements are made in stars, then the elements will combine in stars, but mostly on the Earth because it's cooler there. Where does the energy come from to make molecules? Well, it comes from the motion of molecules, the kinetic energy of molecules and particles flying around, 1/2 mv squared. It comes from heat energy, which is T. It comes from all the things that we talk about in physical chemistry. And the thing to realize is the Big Bang says that originally space itself was compacted to a tiny point, and all the matter was there. And so that tiny point was incredibly hot. There was a lot of random kinetic motion. Then we have the universe expanding, the volume changed, and we started to get not just heat, but heat and work going on. And by the way, if you're saying to yourself the expansion of the universe, well, that's a little bit like work, you are not wrong. So there's a lot of things about this. I think in the data talk, we start to unpack what some of these physical chemistry things do when you apply them to the whole universe. The energy came from the Big Bang. And the energy comes from the more complex structures can happen once the universe cools down. So the idea is that you have this originally very hot universe that's cooling down. As it cools down, you get complexity, because what you happen when it's very hot, when actually all the protons are pushed apart, you have hydrogen and a little bit of helium. In fact, you don't even have hydrogen in a sense, because you have all the electrons floating around and all the protons floating around. As it cools down, electrons and protons get together and you have hydrogen. As that cools down more, you get balls of heated gas that gather together and you have stars. Those produce the more complex elements, and it's all a process of cooling down. You have the potential for something to happen. Another way to look at it is cooling down is one of the ways things happen. Cooling down is spreading out from one state to another. One place energy is heating one part of the universe that's cooler, so the heat energy, and again, that's a problematic term. But you have a difference between this area of the universe that's really hot and this area of the universe that's cool, and they come to a thermal equilibrium. As that happens, the hot part cools down, and then you can have things, once you get below cooled down past certain levels, then you actually have lower energy configurations that can become more stable. This is what a molecule is. When you have a hydrogen atom, another hydrogen atom, and they start to cool down enough so that they're not going around like this, but they start to come together, and the electrons start to become more stable between the two nuclei. That's a stable arrangement, and you have just formed a chemical bond. You have just formed a molecule. By the way, there's some kind of physics thing that I'm remembering where they have detected the first molecule in light from stars. So this actually has to do with astronomy too. The thing is, as you cool down, molecules are moving less, and they can form an arrangement where you have negatives between positives. And that is all a chemical bond is. It's a balance of charges. And once you have carbon, you can have 4 chemical bonds, right? And you can build complex molecules from that. And the question is, okay, in the process of cooling down can actually can freeze in some complexity. Cooling down is also a process of spreading out. The heat energy is spreading out, but the bonds are forming. And you see how we get to some interesting questions about what exactly is going on with energy. So where is the energy coming from? I want you to ask this question. This is a great question to ask. And honestly, for the next parts of the book, maybe one of the things you could do if you're thinking of a question to ask for the future Q&A, ask some kind of energy-related question, because that's what physical chemistry is all about. The energy comes from the Big Bang being hot and the process of the universe cooling down, and then bonds forming and complexity forming. Life is sort of the ability, physically life is a cycle that perpetuates itself, reproduces itself, and feeds itself, and puts out something that is less energy. Life is spreading the universe out in the same way that a star is ultimately spreading the universe out on billions of year time scales. Life works on year or even minute-to-minute time scales. But I want you to look at it as energy, that you have something that is less spread out and you end up spreading it out. In the case of molecules, it's heat that's being spread out. In the case of organisms, it could be food that they eat being spread out as heat and waste. Okay? This is how I want you thinking. So these are great questions, and this is the kind of question that I'm going to ask you to say this back to me in some way on the test. So this is a really good test review, and it shows you how our two books, Our World from Dust and Atkins, are actually coming together here. All right, that's probably enough time. I don't know how much time has been granted. Let's see, 20 minutes. Okay, that's not too bad. 4 minutes per question. All right, hope you are thinking ahead to the test. We've still got a couple of weeks before it. I'll be talking more about it, and hope to see you tomorrow/Friday whenever you're listening to this.